Soundstripe.
Hi, I'm SJ.
And I'm Pegsy.
Welcome to our Heels in the Hierarchy podcast, where we discuss the experiences and challenges faced by aspiring women in the workplace.
We'll share insights to help you gain new perspectives, practical strategies and reassurance. We'll also bring in occasional guests who share their stories and reveal that behind the polished exterior, even accomplished women face challenges just like yours.
We hope you'll laugh, learn and enjoy different perspectives around women in work and leadership. So step inside an episode of Heels in the Hierarchy, empowering women
without stepping on toes.
Well, hello, Pegsy. What are we going to be talking about today?
I thought that it would be really helpful for us to talk about something that came as a bit of a surprise to me today. I had absolutely no idea, but today, the 19th of November, is International Men's Day, something I've genuinely never heard of. And the way that I got to hear about it this morning was listening to a guy called Tim Stanley on Thought for Today, who happened to mention that it was International Men's Day. And I thought, yeah, what? I was really, really surprised by it. So I did Google it, and it is a global awareness day for many issues that men face, including abuse, homelessness, suicide and violence, and is celebrated annually on the 19th of November. There are 6 pillars of International Men's Day, those ones that I've gone through. So it's promoting male role models, celebrating the contribution that men make. And the theme for 2025 is celebrating men and boys. So if you're okay, it's a subject I know nothing about, but are you okay for us to talk about that? Did you know about it?
Well, interestingly, the only reason I knew that it did exist was actually yesterday. And that was because my daughter was informing my son that there's going to be an assembly all about International Men's Day. And I also had to question, I've heard of International Women's Day because that's really important with the history and trying what's going on. But I hadn't really heard anything about why do we, like, almost the naivety was why do we need one, considering that there's so much difficulty about promoting women again, and this nurse's stigma, but the struggles that women have culturally, the biasness that is still out there. And it's quite interesting. I've got a teenage son, and he wasn't even that bothered about it, to be honest. And he was just like, "Oh, that's great, going to be talked to." And it just thinking about it is quite interesting, because obviously what you're saying is there's awareness, and there's a lot of people that are still vulnerable that need that. But I suppose because in our contents with the podcast, it's very much about women in the workplace and things, life themes and things like that, which doesn't necessarily then relate to men are struggling in these areas too. It's about, we're very focused on a different genre and things like that. And it's not saying that there isn't obviously a lot of vulnerability around, but I think it's just not in our awareness, is it, I suppose, of why that needed to be done. And my son's reaction just says it all, really, that nothing that he thought that needed to be celebrated because his life is fine. There's nothing that's really going on, which was it.
But I also thought it was interesting because my immediate reaction was, well, when men rule the world, why do they need to jump on the bandwagon with having a day to commemorate masculinity, which is dominant throughout society, and at times, especially, the times that we're living in, seem to be at the forefront of everything that we do. The focus of International Men's Day was around things like mental health and health in general, and it was useful because it reframed my thinking that in a world that seems so focused on masculinity, that I then sort of stopped myself and thought, well, hang on a minute, I know this stuff. I know that men are not good looking after themselves with their mental health, their physical health, with suicide rates, with going to the doctors with talking about emotions. But it just made me stop and think, and it's not about the thing that's always in front of your face, but actually there's a lot that men need support with from women, but from other men as well, to make talking about those things that they don't talk about more acceptable.
Yeah, I think when it's I think you hit it on the head is this the element of celebrating men is very different to awareness of they have some of the same stigmatism around sharing emotions, talking about their mental health, and the cultural element of, young boys are brought up as still that thing of big boys don't cry, you man up, you need to be provided, working mental health, that's very much kind of a lot of the language that's around, and the difficulty and struggles of men leaning on other men or being very vocal about their psychological well-being, which it almost seems different to then, hey, let's have a celebration about International Men's Day. But actually, this aligns a lot closer to what we, of course, need to be aware of, is the fact that men absolutely cope differently and have a different way. And we need to keep that in the forefront, because honestly, even as women, we are surrounded by, whether we've got grandchildren, children, people in our workplaces, being aware that actually their way of coping is going to be completely different. And we've talked about it, I think, quite a lot, the fact that women are quite open generally. We talk things out, we connect, we need connection. And that is something that is very, very relevant, especially this time of year with the darker days, the struggle about people not necessarily having the motivation. We know that stats around men's mental health. And I think in a recent survey, actually in the UK, they found that many 4 in 10 just don't discuss their mental health at all, but it's with closest friends. Because for me, women use their closest friends as their almost not necessarily therapists, but very much around just touching base about what's happening with them. The fact that people's closest friends and family with medical professionals have no idea what's going on, that's the biggest concern for me, that I don't even know if that's really shifted the needle. So going back to what we're talking about, I think it's absolutely relevant we bring it into talking about it today.
The fact that men still in 2025 struggle to share their feelings, struggle with their mental health, is both a surprise and not a surprise. We know that men die by suicide. They die at double the rate of women. In England and Wales, in 2023, the male suicide rate was 17.4 deaths per 100,000, compared to the female rate of 5.7%. And we also know that men in their 30s are quite likely to die by suicide. What I didn't realise was that actually there's a really high suicide rate for men aged 50 to 54. I think that's because there's been a lot of focus on younger men. And there's all sorts of reasons why people might die by suicide. But maybe that percentage can come down if we create a society where men see themselves able to deal with their physical and mental health issues more openly and earlier, and also to share their emotions with each other, to encourage those dialogues to go on.
But maybe it did make me think around just generally that UK survey that I was talking about, is that even when people talking about whether they would share or not share, it does say that even 40% report they'd rather have thoughts of self-harm or going to end their life than even going to go and seek professional help.
Goodness me.
A lot of thinking around not only about what is stopping them, but actually what they're seeing around them. And actually, it's not just about the bad stuff. I've seen an increase in people in the media, for example, in our culture, who are sharing the struggles. And I
Yes.
think, it's been obviously we do an episode around mental health awareness. We don't want this whole episode to be on mental health, but I
No.
do think it's around the culture in which boys are getting brought up in, as well as men, about what they see, what do they listen to, what do they have. But I do think there's lots of people in the media or people in their cultural circles that have started to really be very open and vulnerable around their own awareness about being able to change that narrative. So then it's less of something that needs to be hidden, but actually it's embraced. And these are successful people. So if, the first person comes to mind is Adam Peaty. So he's a three-time world gold medalist in swimming. And people see him as this peacocking swimmer. But actually, when he's an advocate now for around the whole mental health sector in men and sport. And I think that's really, really good for me anyway, to see this is somebody that is not only successful in sport or successful in that, but that probably people be looking up to. And if someone like that can be very open to say, I've had to take time away, I've had to be able to really focus on myself, I've had burnout, I've had depression, I need to really think about how mental health impacts me, but also to the people around me, and open about it and his struggles, then that gives me a little bit of glimpse of hope that it's not all gloom and gloom, and that this is always around people not talking about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I remember some very vulnerable interviews that Adam Peaty did when he was having those struggles. And I remember thinking how valuable it was for somebody, as you say, who'd kind of got a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a peacock, hugely successful and at the top of his game. And then to share not only the nature of what he shared in terms of his own struggles, but knowing that he'd got a public platform and being prepared to go out and risk being criticised by other men for being emotional about the things that he was sharing and doing it anyway was so, so invaluable, because it gave a real value to what it was he was saying. And it was almost like, I don't care if I get any blowback from it. I'm going to do it anyway because I'm aware that I've got a social platform, and I'm aware that people will listen to what I have to say, and I have to say it for them, but also my own self. And the person that I then think about was Gareth Southgate. He used to be the England football coach. Disclosure here, I'm not heavily into football, but if it's a World Cup and we're doing well, or internationals and we're doing well, I might watch it. But the reason I mentioned Gareth Southgate again was he'd been a high profile footballer. He'd had that infamous penalty kick incident where he kicked for a penalty and then missed, and he had to overcome that, pick himself up and start go back to footballing, and then evolve into a football manager. So he was aware of all of the emotions of his team when he was coaching the England team, because he'd been there and done it. Was hugely supportive, but also the way in which he set very high moral standards and had a supporting arm around his team at the same time. And actually how well they did, I think, not only because of their footballing prowess, but because he was both a father figure and a big brother to them during their time on the world stage. I just thought, a lot of what he did was really brilliant.
Well, I think what was interesting is I'm again like you. I like sport. Football's not one of them, but I will obviously watch when it's big cup games. And what was interesting is when he was doing certain things, I would notice myself deliberately making a comment to my son, going, this is a man that, is a good role model. And you're like, what? I'm like, he's talking about emotional intelligence. He's talking about, in his things, about how boys need better role models. He's talking about emotional resilience and being okay that he can be upset. He's
Yeah.
very vocalized. And I think he's embodied his own negative experiences to be able to be very open about men need other men, but also people, role models who can be vulnerable, that actually can be honest about things of difficulty, but also need to stand firm and be okay with that and not have any shame. And I think part of that is that's what those stats was around, is that people would rather hurt themselves because of the shame rather than being vulnerable. And here's a man very open about, he's had a lot of toxicity, I don't know the word, but negativity towards him. But actually, that's not allowed him to be shaped to a bitter manager and somebody that's trying to prove himself. Actually, he's then shaped himself to have integrity and being somebody that people will look up to and respect and actually protect as teammates. So I think that itself shows volumes. And I think you're right. He's a really good role model in terms of being very open about how important it is. So you're right. It's not always about what he wasn't achieving, because obviously sometimes people only remember you about all the things you didn't do, especially in sport.
Yeah.
But actually, he's done that in a really positive way, hasn't he? And been a really good way of stepping up to say people need mentorship, which is something I think is important.
Yeah. Anyone else who springs to mind in terms of a good role model, perhaps outside sport? 'Cause it's not really something football and swimming. They're not.
Sport. Yeah, it does come to mind when you say that. And I think a lot of people probably relate because they might have not watched a lot of the films, but it's Keanu Reeves.
Oh, yeah.
You see a lot of it on social media. You probably see a lot of things on Instagram.
Yeah.
For those who, I don't know where people have been if they haven't watched The Matrix. I'm not gonna lie, or Speed, any of the old classics, But he's very, well, I would say, renowned for not the films.
Yeah.
About the way that he portrays himself as a human being.
Yeah.
So, being a lot of things around. He will take public transport because he doesn't want to waste the money on that. He will happily walk around speaking to the homeless on the street. He will, there's been a lot of things around, why does he dress like that? Because he doesn't need to have a status.
Yeah.
He wants to integrate everybody. He's very open about his childhood. He's very, very much around wanting to encourage and be authentic in who he is. So I think that's something that's really important to think about if it's not, sometimes we do sport, but as an actor, but actually as a person as well.
Well, you mentioned The Matrix. He once took a pay cut so that the cast and crew were able to get more money. There reaches a point in time with a lot of people's wealth where they really don't need any more. So he was aware of how much he was earning compared to the people that were underpinning his success through their professional skills. He's gifted motorbikes and other acts of kindness across the film industry. But his sort of generosity isn't the only thing, as you say. He is really well known for balancing his own privacy with humility and treating everyone with respect, but also talking really openly about his challenges in much the same way as, like we were saying with Adam Peaty.
I think that what balances him well not is not just about kindness and generosity and talking about his feelings, but he's relatable in our generation because he's had such personal tragedy in his life. So he talks about the loss of his wife, he talks about the loss of his daughter, he talks about the loss of his best friend, and yet he continues to have that platform of being very consistent in his way of working. And I think that speaks volumes, because when we talk about how we're going to reach these, how we're going to change the culture in which we're having, Well, actually, it's having more people to authentically live out what we want to see more of.
Mm.
So when we're going back to the story of like my son not really bothered, it kind of piped me a little bit because I'm sure you've seen that film Adolescence that's come out. It's
Yes.
controversy about how, we've gone back 20 years, 30 years, whatever, how people perceive women. But actually, when I look at people like these role models that we've talked about, when I look at my son going, okay, he's actually turning out all right. He's not betraying these traits. There is some really good ones, and we can easily focus on things that is not healthy and all the things that's going wrong. But actually, how are we going to use our platform to encourage the men around us, to support them to go, actually, there is people like that, but that's not who you need to listen to. You need to be thinking about vulnerability as a strength, that resilience is something that you should be proud of, that actually being humble and kind is a trait that is an attractive trait to have.
Yeah.
You can be a masculine man or not. None of that matters if your character is flawed. And your character, the flawness that we worry about, I think, is around attitudes.
I think that's interesting as well, though, because we talk about men sometimes being in touch with their feminine side. We talk a lot about men being overly masculine, almost as if they're the front and back of a person's character. And they're not. A person's personality, their character, the way they present themselves and the way they live their values is multifaceted. When we talk about men and their feminine side, in some respects, it has the potential to come across as being very demeaning and wrong. And if we want well-rounded men and contributors to society, we need to get other men talking about emotions and health and well-being and all of those really important topics that make society better. We need to give those much better platforms than a lot of the negativity that we hear. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about International Men's Day was that when I Googled what International Men's Day was about and realised its mission, it came on the back of listening to the current American president berating two women reporters in two different instances. One was the day before yesterday, where on Air Force One, a woman reporter asked him a question about Jeffrey Epstein, and he said, shut up, piggy. Now, this is the leader of the biggest democracy in the world. And he says that he really doesn't have time for political correctness. There's nothing political about this. This is just about respecting a fellow human being. So we have people like Trump who have a massive platform, really being vindictive and nasty. You've got a lot of social media that seems to promote male aggression. And, there are frequent reports about young men going into their room, logging onto computers and going down these dreadful rabbit holes and allegedly feeling emasculated, where they don't feel that they have a contribution to make in society. And yet we've just been talking about really positive role models and how you can be a whole human being and still talk openly about your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your health, your relationships.
There's a lot there, isn't it? It all comes back to when you're saying is the impact and the influences that you listen to.
Yeah.
Really. Because if you're listening to people who have a very toxic language and are surrounding themselves for their own purposes, that's always going to create more toxicity and difficulty. But if you only focus on that, then you're not enabling yourself to ally to other men in your life, or celebrate the fact that not everyone has to be like that. And actually, let's develop an awareness and a culture of both empathy, understanding, and support for people, especially boys and men, to be able to talk about it. So, yes, understand that there is always going to be this aspect that we're very consciously aware of that is increasing around the toxicity. But actually, on today, is going, actually, well, if we know all of this, and what is our responsibility as mothers, as sisters, as employers, as people work, what do we actually need to do? And it definitely made me think about, well, actually, it's about spotting the signs. So, when you do start work, you talk about awareness of radicalism. You think about things like that. It's the same thing, the signs in terms of ill health in men. So, for example, like real bad changes in mood or energy levels, compulsive risk-taking behaviours, secrecy, feeling anxious, overwhelmed, that all increases. And if we're in people's lives, we should be noticing that. Same as we expect our closest people to be noticing our moods and how things are changing, to check them up for that. And going back to the point that you mentioned around people going in their rooms and being on their phones or watching things, that's the element around social isolation. So are they not doing things that they would normally do? Are they spending a lot more time? Are we able to find, I'm always aware to be able to track what my children are watching and how long for and what they're doing. But I suppose with particularly is actually being able to say, actually, we need to check up on these things. We need to ask those questions. We need to give them options. And the other side really is the anger and irritability that comes with those mood swings, because there's something else that may be triggering all of that. And it's workaholics, when we're talking about people don't talk about, so they'll stay at work and work longer hours and I'll take on the stress, for example, that increases your work excessively. But how are they going to cope with that? So alcohol, drugs, smoking. I think if we start becoming more alert, that just as we have our triggers when it comes to stress and the way that we are impacted by the world around us, then if we do the same thing with the men in our lives, to celebrate and be grateful for the fact they're not toxic, and actually be aware and grateful for what they do bring to our lives, mention that and, be able to do that, but also maybe being able to check in on them more if we notice all these kind of things. So I think if we increase the awareness that's in our circle around the voices we listen to, so more role models, encouraging that, that's our circle of influence. So we can increase that and point our men and children to that. Then actually,
I think it's easy to have people with very loud voices take over the platform, and as a result of that, potentially create a bit of a movement that goes towards that misogynistic viewpoint, and that it's acceptable to berate women. And on the other end of that is the isolation, where young men and boys are increasingly isolated or are at risk of going down rabbit holes. But, as you were saying, fundamentally, we know from our own experiences with the men in our circle, there's some incredibly decent men out there, and perhaps the norm doesn't get quite the platform that it should. But we do this podcast because we want to empower women, and we want to encourage women to understand their role and their value in the workplace. And of course, so much of what we do in the workplace is about value for money and return on investment and what's the business case. And I think it was yesterday, the Princess of Wales delivered a speech to businesses and said that it was important to value time and tenderness as much as productivity and success.
It's really lovely, actually.
It's a lovely expression, isn't it? What she's essentially saying is that for businesses, every one of us interacts with our own environment a home, a family, a business, a workforce, a community. These are ecosystems that you yourselves help to weave. Imagine a world where each of these environments were built on valuing time and tenderness just as much as productivity and success, and about, as business leaders, finding the balance between profitability and having a positive impact, because the two are not and should not be incompatible. And again, the juxtaposition of the negativity that was going on there, and then the positive objective of creating International Men's Day. And it just redresses a lot of the balance, doesn't it? There's a lot of noise, but the noise doesn't mean that that's everybody and everything. You know, there are so many good men, good male advocates in the public eye, and many, many, many more being good dads, good teachers, good partners, that it's easy to forget them in all of the noise of the negativity that we get presented with.
Yeah. Again, I think the learning from, I suppose, the conversation from today really is, you started with the why do they need one, to now we need to celebrate, we need more. We need more of the pointing to what is good role modelling, what is supportive. We want a culture where we don't fear for the next generation of men, but actually, because if we can keep encouraging what we need to see more of, then actually that's why we need to have these days, in order to celebrate, actually, this is what we need to think about. This is what you want to encourage people to keep going. That, yes, like I said, there is noise. There's a lot of noise. There's always people that want to shout the loudest. And that's the problem. The people that shout the loudest get heard, but the ones that are actually the most vulnerable get lost. And we want to spin that to go listen to the people that may get lost, help them to become really good, seen individuals, and let's support a culture where they are advocates for other people as well, like the ones that we've talked about today. And maybe next year we'll be having another one going, how much have we learned? How much have we celebrated this year? Because actually we need allies just as much as we do our females, especially in the workplace. So I've really enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah.
So it's been a quite eye-opener that there is a National Men's Day every November, and knowing exactly what it's about helps to think about it in a different way, I think, and have the focus.
I was remembering while you were speaking, you've got this expression about praise the behaviour you want to see more of. And I think that's my takeaway from our conversation, that, you know, there's so much negativity about men in the world at the moment, but ordinary, hardworking, thoughtful men are what we need more of, and we can only get more of them if we encourage men to encourage other men to be more open, because then they're more rounded.
Yeah.
And it just makes for a better society. No,
totally agree. I think it just made me laugh, because I was thinking, obviously, just as we end, it is, you know, our tagline very much is around when we kind of say keep your heels high and keep your standards higher. But actually, that's what we want to say to men. Keep your standards high. You know, straighten up and be proud of who you are.
Yes.
And I think that's a really nice way to kind of end, really, I think, is that we want men to do exactly what we expect for ourselves to do around the standards that we want other people to live up to. So, yeah.
And then, just as a bit of a recap, International Men's Day, global awareness for the many issues that men face, including abuse, homelessness, suicide, and violence. I've become a convert. I think International Men's Day is a good thing, and that we very much should celebrate it and encourage other men and other women actually to be aware of it and the work that they seem to be doing.
Sounds right. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed, please download the podcast on any of your platforms that you listen on. Share, like, and follow so others can enjoy. Until next time, keep your heels high and your standards higher.